Howdy, today on Flipping Science we're looking at biodiversity.
Biodiversity. All life living in this community. Biodiversity. All around and inside you and me. Biodiversity. Species, and the family tree. Biodiversity. So important to the world community.
So science understanding we're going to look at. Biodiversity is the variety of all living things, including diversity in genetics, species, and ecosystems. Distinguish between a species, population, community, and ecosystem. Describe diversity in terms of species and ecosystems. So, biodiversity, what is it? It's the variety found in all living things. And we separate it into three big groups: diversity in genes, diversity in species, and diversity in ecosystems. So I'll talk about each of these briefly. If you have a great diversity in the genes of the organisms in your population, that means there's a wide variety of genes that can be selected from in the ecosystem, and that can lead to better success of the organisms in that ecosystem. Where you have a limited supply of genes, that can lead to issues such as inbreeding and inbreeding depression, which influences and affects organisms that are produced from reproduction. An example of this is in cheetahs. There's a very low genetic diversity in cheetahs, so there's a lot of inbreeding depression present in cheetahs. That's due to the lack of diversity in their genes. Diversity in species is where you have in an area a large number of different species. And again, generally speaking, the more species you have, the more healthy the ecosystem, and that's because there's more interactions between members of different species and the same species in the ecosystem, and that leads to things like competition. There are diversity in ecosystems as well. So here we have an ecosystem. This is a tundra type ecosystem. We have mountains, we have ground. It's pretty chilly there. But there are a wide variety of ecosystems that are present on Earth. There are what's so-called biodiversity hotspots, and these are all over the world, and they're recognised by the UN. There's one in Australia, in the southwest of Western Australia. All of New Zealand is a biodiversity hotspot. This is where you find particularly great numbers of different species in a particular area. So what is a species? This definition we're using here is a bit problematic, but it's one that's commonly used. A species is any group of individuals that are capable of interbreeding with each other, but not with another species. So down here we have pandas. Pandas are only capable of having baby pandas with other pandas. There's a key thing here, and that is that the offspring that are produced need to be fertile. They're fertile once they reach sexual maturity. So a horse and a donkey can have a baby. They have a baby called a mule, but mules can't have their own babies. And there's reasons for that we'll look at later on in this topic. Here we have different breeds of dog. So we have wolves, dingoes, coyotes, and collies. These are all members of the same species, so they can all have offspring with each other, and those offspring that they have are fertile. When you have a species, you have individuals that are capable of producing offspring that are fertile with each other, but they can't do it with members of other species. We call this reproductive isolation. We're going to have a look at some methods of reproductive isolation later on. So we've talked about a species, now we need to define what a population is. In ecology, a population is a group of the same species living in a habitat at a particular time. So down here we have an Antarctic habitat. We can see we've got members, two separate species here. So there's the penguins here, and then we've got the seals. So there's two different populations living in this habitat at this time. Over here we can see several different species making up different populations in a reef habitat. So we can see these fish here, they're of the same species. We can see this fish and this fish here, they're of the same species too. So we have different populations of these species living in a 3-2-1. So we have different populations of species living in a habitat, and that's what we call populations. So these fish are members of a population, these fish are members of a population. Now we need to define what a community is. A community is all the populations that live in the same ecosystem. So if we have a look at a picture down here, we have several different populations. We've got the rabbits, we've got the snakes, we've got the foxes, we've got the birds, but we've also got the trees. All of those different populations in the same ecosystems make up the community. So down here we have some different populations in the community. We have elephants, we've got these birds, we've got the grass. So those different species make up different populations, but they're all in the same area, so they're part of the same ecosystem, so that makes them a community. Over here again we've got a few different species. So we have a lion, we've got zebras, and we've got these birds as well. So we have different populations because they're each members of different species, but they're in the same area, so that makes up a community. So the living things in the area are the community. The last definition we have is an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is the community of living organisms, but it's also the physical environment as well. And we break up the ecosystem into what we call biotic factors and abiotic factors. So the biotic factors are everything that's living, and this little picture down here shows it well. So we have the biotic factors down here, so this is everything that's living. So it's the grass, it's the trees, it's our elephant, it's our deer, it's our zebra, it's our lion. So they're our living things that are present in the environment. They make up the biotic factors. Then we have the abiotic factors, the things that aren't alive. So the air, the mountains, the sun, the water, the soil, the temperature, which you can't really see here, but it exists, the pH of the soil, the pH of the water. So these are physical things that are present in the environment, and they have an influence on the living things in the environment. So that's abiotic, these are biotic. Together, those things make up your ecosystem. When you talk about the diversity present on Earth in terms of species and ecosystems, we're going to start with species. The number of species on Earth hasn't been determined. It's very difficult to do so, but there's large estimates out there. But there's a huge range within the estimates, so the estimates aren't particularly useful by themselves. So 2 million to about 1 trillion species present on Earth. Only 1.6 million species have been added to databases so far. So there's a large amount of classification that has to be done on the species that we know of that haven't been catalogued yet. Just to give you an idea of the numbers of species, if we just look at animals, there's only 5,000 mammal species, about 10,000 bird species, about 10,000 reptile species, about 15,000 amphibian species, 40,000 fish species, so that's a large number when we're looking at just chordates, so these are things with backbones. But if we look at insects, there's about 5 million insect species. So if we have a look at this picture down here, we can see the pie chart. So when I was talking about all the chordates, that's these guys down here, this orange wedge, the insects make up about half of the total diversity in terms of organisms. And this doesn't include bacteria though, so that's a thing to note. So the insects make up about half of all the species that we know of on Earth. This Circle of Life was released a few years ago. This is showing all the big groups of organisms and when they evolved, when they separated off from common ancestors. So we start about 3.5 billion years ago with the first single-celled organism, and then we get this radiation. If we have a look around this Circle of Life, we can see the big groups of organisms. So we have the archaea. These are single-celled bacteria type things, and then we have the bacteria next to them. Then we have our amoeboids, diatoms, brown algae. Then we have Archaeplastidia, so green algae. Then we have our plants, then we have our fungi. Then we have our very early on animals, so Cnidaria, which are jellyfish, sponges. Then we have our deuterostomes. We're in this group here, so we're in this little section here. We have our mollusks and segmented worms, we have our roundworms, and then all the rest of it is insects. If we have a look at the grouping of insects in there, if we break it up, if you had all the animals walking past you in a line, every fourth animal would be a beetle, which is just one type of insect. So that gives you an idea of how dominant insects are on the surface of the planet. They're not very, 3, 2, 1, they're not as common under the water. We do have crustaceans under the water, but it's definitely on the surface they are dominant. So just to give you some examples of some different species, these are all from when I went to the US. This is from Washington, D.C. Spider was from the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, and the rest here from National Zoo in Washington, D.C. So this spider is a bird-eating spider. It's quite big. They can take 10 years to reach maturity, and the females can live up to 20 years old. They have the fur on the back. They can spray at you if they don't like you and it gets itchy. Down here we have an African elephant. They're quite big, the largest land mammal. We have a Sumatran tiger from Asia over here. We have a golden poison arrow frog from South America. These guys are quite toxic. The bright yellow color tells you as a predator not to eat the frog, otherwise it could be quite bad for you. And here we have a giant Pacific octopus. You can see one of its vents down here. So these are all from different ecosystems present all over in different parts of the world. So these two are tropical, reasonably. Africa is more savanna-y. Asia, tropical rainforest as well. And the Pacific Ocean for the octopus. Now we have, so we've got 3 chordates, so these have backbones. We've got 2 mammals and an amphibian. We've got an arachnid, so the spider, and we've got a mollusk, the octopus. So now Flipping Science, we looked at biodiversity. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.